Ponaganko. I'm a labor market expert at the ETF, and it's a really great pleasure for me to introduce the seminar that it's already a third in the series. I would kindly ask everyone to mute the microphones while not speaking, because our meeting will be recorded, and it's also to have a good sound quality. And before we really start the meeting, let me just quickly introduce some little technicalities which might be very helpful throughout the seminar. First, very important point is that we have interpretation available in Arabic and in Russian, and you can access both channels by clicking a little globe at the menu bar. The presentations that we will see today during the seminar will be also shared after the event in Arabic and in Russian. Then a very important point is that our chat function is put at your disposal, and we will be very happy to receive your reflections, comments, or questions, which we will try to pick up throughout the seminar. Today, we will reflect on how to foster innovation and impactful actions for the recovery, a very exciting topic. And the agenda is also very promising. We have very interesting interventions today. But also I can see that our seminar seems rather successful, which also shows the interest and the need for such a discussion, such a sharing, and such a reflection. Our meeting will be divided into two parts. The first one I will have the pleasure to guide you through is dedicated to innovation and to active labor market reforms. And we will look from the perspective of 1 year after, how actually the pandemic impacted active labor market measures and the activities of public employment services. The second part will be guided by my colleague Cristina Mereuta, and will be dedicated to active labor market policies effectiveness. We will reflect on how to build back better, a very important and big theme, while fostering more impactful active labor market policies. We will also have some little polls throughout the seminar, which will be introduced by my colleague Eva Jansova. And with this very little technical warm-up, we can now start. And let me invite first Manuela Prina, who is the head of Skills Identification and Development Unit, who will share with us some introductory remarks on the context of the ETF work and some reflections and about our actions. So Manuela, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ivona, and good morning and good afternoon to all of you, depending on where you are and from where you reach us. It's always, for me, nice to have a Zoom meeting, and I really love when people keep their microphone open, because I see very, many familiar names and faces for those that have the camera on. And I imagine, meeting just before the meeting and having a coffee together and exchanging a few words with each other. I think really it's, for all of us, it's really tiring to be on screen all the time. And especially today, with the topic we will discuss today, I think, and I was thinking through that as people were joining in the meeting, if we would leave all the cameras on and all the microphones on, we would hear many voices and see many faces. And I think this is a bit the symbol of what active labor market policies are about. are about really reaching out to each person with different needs, different voices, and different contexts, of course, in the moment where the need is there. So I think today, and why I really support very much this discussion, is that it's true, and we'll take the time to go through a lot of work that has been done to bring good evidence to see what is working, how things can be improved, and what is there in terms of innovation and effectiveness. But we need to do that with a sense of urgency. And I think this is shared by all of us. We know that it's really urgent and we don't have much time to think. And so among all the voices, it's important to also pick up the one that is really helping us to make the right choices to support citizens and to support all people that are really in need to have support and to find solutions to address the impact of the pandemic. Now, we actually started to reflect on this topic together last October. And the first question that we raised was, what was the role of skills? And we had an interesting discussion where we saw that actually skills were not that much in the picture, but we know that if skills are not in the picture, we are not only risking in the immediate term, but we create also a vacuum that can impact generations for the future. So the first seminar, we actually looked at the skills dimension in active labor market policies, saying and discussing how much was important to really have skills as part of the solution. Then we had a second seminar later in the year, at the beginning of December, where we looked at some practices where instead skills was really part of this solution, sharing examples and good practices. Now we come back in the discussion with the evidence that has been acquired through research and studies conducted by the ETF, where we look on one side at the effectiveness of active labor market policies in addressing needs, and on the other side on innovative practices that can be also shared. And this is very important, and this is what this seminar is about. It's about, of course, sharing and learning together. Why? To actually do this acceleration, because needs are very similar, despite, of course, the diversities of context of all countries, and also the diversity of needs of the different citizens and age groups and different social contexts. But there is a lot of space for commonalities, for issues that are really being augmented by the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic, not only in the immediate term, but also looking ahead for the future. And as I said, I think it's very important that we look at this with the sense of urgency that is really important when we look at the skills dimension and making decisions regarding how to support skilling, upskilling and reskilling for the future, but also how skills become an essential part of active labor market policies to confront the issues today and to build a better future together. So today we will have really plenty of good practices, exchanges, but it's also important to start a discussion about priorities for the future and how to set priorities that can really help a better future to integrate an inclusive and also to make the best out of possibilities that are there brought by the digitalization, the greening, and the prospects that can be built at country and also international level. So let me wish you a very good seminar and exchange together. I very much look forward to this third seminar and to see this itinerary progressing. And I hope very much that we will be able together to listen to all the different voices and see all the different faces of people that are really waiting for us to make decisions and to also support the decision makers to make decisions for an inclusive and active and skills-based future for all. So thank you, Ivona, back to you.
Thank you very much, Manuela. With this excellent introduction, we can actually already start our reflection. And here I would like to invite Mr. Iman Davern to explain us and to guide us through some findings on active labor market reforms and innovation, key findings from a research conducted by Fondazione Brodolini and the European Training Foundation. And Iman is a senior expert at Fondazione Brodolini. Please, Iman, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the introduction. Could we move straight away to slide 4, if that's okay, please? Thank you very much. I'll be very briefly setting the scene for the very interesting discussion this morning. Unfortunately, there's no time to go into much, if any, detail about the studies that we conducted, but I commend to colleagues 3 really interesting case studies produced by some excellent experts from the Republic of North Macedonia, Moldova and Jordan, where we specifically drilled down into a bit more detail as to the implications of the COVID crisis and some lessons for how we may formulate some positive responses to this. In terms of the work that we set ourselves, we focused on 3 specific questions. We were looking at financial support for enterprises, business, and of course, individual citizens, considering measures which have been introduced to try and address skills issues which were identified by the crisis, and particularly how public employment services had adapted to meet the contingencies of COVID. In terms of our methodology, we did some extensive mapping, looking at European Union, European Economic Area, and the wider ETF partner country community, and to identify countries that we thought would be very good examples to illustrate and illuminate some of the issues that colleagues are facing, of course, globally as a consequence of the pandemic. And we had fortunately access to some really good sources. The European Union Public Employment Service Network is always a wonderful source of information, as indeed is the ILO, in terms of information on trends and developments in the world of delivery and policy evolution. And some excellent work has been done by Eurofound, the World Bank, and of course ETF to very quickly get into gear to take the temperature in terms of what was happening in responses to COVID immediately when the crisis had emerged. So if we can please move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. In terms of our research, we concentrated on 3 particular areas, looking at support for individuals, employment promotion measures, and indeed adaptation of services. So what trends did we identify in this regard? Clearly, one of the key responses was an enhancement of short-time work schemes, an entirely kind of, I think, logical and well-considered response. The policy challenge now is deciding at which stage that short-time work scheme should be reduced and indeed eventually removed when they are no longer required. Clearly, such schemes can result in distortions if they are left in place too long, but of course they were a vital and key response which have been able to do several things, maintaining employment for workers who may otherwise have been made redundant, and also some creativity in we discovered schemes where employers working in concert with governments have enabled workers to retrain and upskill during times when there was less demand, which was making good use of less use for their skills to be able to build the capacity of companies to recover more strongly post the COVID situation. Access to unemployment benefits has been reviewed in many countries, both in terms of relaxations, in terms of requirements for citizens to engage and provide regular updates to systems as a temporary expedient, but also some initial expansion of coverage, or certainly particularly, perhaps even more so, plans to expand coverage to ensure that systems are in a better place to deal with a future crises which may occur. And particularly in terms of business support, particular evidence of lots of support for the small employers, very logical given the extent to which small employers are an absolutely major source of employment across Europe and the wider ETF regions, and particularly looking at the issues of informal work. I think one thing that's happened with the COVID crisis that we have identified from our research studies is that many long-standing issues have now been placed under somewhat of a magnifying glass, and the need to address them has become even more apparent. And so governments, employment institutions, looking at what can be done to try and enhance the transition from the informal to the formal economy, to remove some citizens from precarious situations, and indeed to encourage companies to be involved in a relationship with government that's far more positive and beneficial for their future prospects as well. In terms of measures to foster employment, I think colleagues will not be surprised to know that perhaps the most leading feature that has emerged is an increased enhancement of the need to adapt to the digital world. One quote that I've heard many times in the last year, and forgive me, I've repeated it a few times myself, is that COVID has encouraged governments to take 6 years activity in 6 months. A real need to actually put the foot on the accelerator or the gas to perhaps put into train lots of activities that we were planning but did not seem so urgent. So an emphasis on the digital delivery of training to enable people to access training products where they cannot engage face to face, which of course there is an old saying that no crisis, no matter how dreadful, comes without some opportunities. And indeed the fact that people were engaging with training digitally enhances their ability to, of course, access opportunities in the labour market, and training can be offered more flexibly where people are not in an easy position to have to travel some distances to attend traditional training courses. So clearly both the medium for delivering training and indeed the competence and capacity of citizens to use digital skills being enhanced. Governments looking at an increased use of digital service delivery platforms, wage subsidies and job creation stimulus being perhaps the two main fiscal interventions in terms of employment support. And again, the question arises as to ensuring that subsidies can be well targeted, making sure they are not obviously causing any longer term difficulties in terms of substitution and displacement and deadweight, and a view as to at what stage the subsidies will no longer be required. And indeed, I think a theme throughout our research was that some existing activities that had been particularly kind of well considered and were showing signs of being successful being further adapted. And one I will mention is some interesting work I was involved in a few months ago, where the government of Uzbekistan are looking at a very broad and comprehensive public works schemes, which have been pretty successful, looking at how that may be adapted to deal with the need for a more enhanced activation focus following the COVID crisis and the recovery. Very briefly looking at employment service adaptations for the crisis. Perhaps if I could reflect for 30 seconds just on our case studies. 3 countries we looked at. North Macedonia and Moldova had already lots of policy changes which had been developed in many regards as a response to the crisis from 2008. So over ensuing years, a adaptation to ensure that the labour market was in a better position to respond to a future shock. A difference between those 2 countries was that North Macedonia had been able to invest in increasing staffing from about 2017, and as a consequence was able to deliver, I think, a slightly larger proportion of its planned activities during the crisis than in the year before, which is quite a remarkable achievement in many regards. But I think the key there was that there was an ongoing upward trajectory trajectory for staffing. So that meant that there was already more capacity coming on stream. Moldova, considering some not dissimilar approaches, but unfortunately there was a situation whereby increased requirements to deliver new policy responses had happened at the same time as a budgetary reduction in terms of operational capacity in the employment service, with consequences, of course, that it was not possible to deliver to the same degree the planned changes, which, if the staffing capacity had been there, might have enabled a slightly more successful response to dealing with the crisis situation. Notwithstanding that, some very well considered approaches in North Macedonia, particularly some creativity in Moldova, looking at enhancing rural outreach and making use of social worker capacity to ensure that some people in isolated rural areas were able to be accessed and connected to services during the crisis. The third example from Jordan, Jordan at the moment does not really have a coordinated overarching institutional frame for the delivery of employment and active policies. Many of the active policies are delivered by NGOs, and our expert from Jordan produced a really excellent study, but a key lesson there was the lack of a pre-existing institutional frame made it quite difficult to introduce any particular adaptations to services and responses, and indeed the main focus in Jordan was some emergency measures to maintain employment rather than any particular adaptation to employment policy delivery. So looking at the time and quickly moving to conclusions, but perhaps finally in terms of adaptations, there were obviously measures taken to reduce the scope for face-to-face services, because there was a need, of course, to protect staff and the public given the COVID pandemic. Countries moved to alternative channels. One area we noticed was a general lack of pre-existing digital capacity and capability in many countries meant that the response was perhaps through some service reduction and removal, but often perhaps more of a dependence on the telephone contact, which of course is preferable to not connecting with citizens at all. But a lesson learned was the more we can develop digital channels in future, countries will be in a stronger position to deal with future crises. And indeed, an adaptation to digital services can be a good thing in itself because of the extra capability, flexibility and capacity that can be delivered by them. Many countries looking at more immediate analysis of labour market information to try and get a fix for the real most recent information on the interruption to labour market activity and balance as a consequence of the crisis. And in context of an overall review of service models and thoughts about how their channel strategies can be adapted in the future, many countries introducing emergency crisis management teams to try and see how social partners and government institutions generally can be better coordinated and to get a more focused response and better connections between the different potential support partners. Next slide, please. In terms of the challenges, particularly, one that was rather apparent from the work was in some countries a lack or rather insufficient coordination of data. So provision of services by a number of different actors, but perhaps a lack of traditional kind of coordination in terms of data collation and collection and comparison between delivery agencies, and particularly perhaps lots of scope to increase the compatibility of IT systems to ensure there can be more transversal data analysis to look at the overall quantum of the consequences of the support measures being employed. An ongoing need that colleagues will know we have discussed for many years, but a real apparent requirement to absolutely enhance the focus on ensuring that VET education skills policy generally really reflects the needs of the labour market, which have been placed into an even sharper focus as a consequence of COVID. So looking at skills VET provision, which is there to really ensure that it is training and reskilling citizens to meet the emerging labour market demand from the crisis. Clearly that again is a reference to digital skills, perhaps the green economy, but overall transitions towards the new labour market emerging from the crisis as we move into the more knowledge-based economy and society. Clearly, the overall economic environment is continuing volatile. Commentators are predicting rather a large range of responses in terms of the effect on GDP in different countries as a consequence of the crisis. So still some uncertainty. So we need to make sure that analysis is rigorous and best informed, so we can be making our decisions based on the most robust assumptions that we can. Clearly, COVID has been occurring at the same time as a kind of unprecedented and perhaps welcome, hopefully, international focus on the whole issue of climate change. And so in conjunction with the more digitalised work for the future, clearly there seems to be now an emerging global consensus about the need for the greening of economies. So a challenge to ensure that employment policies can reflect the opportunities from both the green economy and the knowledge economy and digitalisation. As a consequence of COVID, there has again been an enhancement of the automation of production processes, or plans to do so in many sectors of the economy. So we need to make sure that the most vulnerable, who are often those left furthest behind in any kind of labour market disruption, are not left in an even more precarious situation. So we need to enhance the focus on activation for discouraged workers and the long-term unemployed. The capacity to do that is a challenge. That increased digital contact in employment delivery systems does of its own volition create more capacity for providing more intensive support for those people who need it. And so clearly a need to again review service delivery models to meet those contingencies. And with an eye on the time, moving to our last slide, a number of recommendations. I don't think there's time to go through them in detail, but I'll just pick out a few for your consideration. Clearly a need to look at skills for the future. Obviously a need to really enhance partnership working. Digitalisation, one of its many benefits is it does greatly increase the potential to offer personalised services to citizens by collating data and more fluid exchange of information between support actors. And so clearly a need to perhaps think about more closer working between providers to ensure that citizens can be provided with the skills to equip them for taking advantage of future labour market opportunities. A real need for enhanced outreach that particularly I think is relevant to those living in more isolated rural areas. A continuing need for short-time work approaches, but then close consideration and careful consideration of when those schemes need to be eased and potentially removed. And I think something that we should have been thinking about before, and I'm sure were, but even more of a need now in terms of unemployment insurance systems. The labour market was already changing rapidly. We hear very much about the fourth industrial revolution, the idea now that we're in the middle of really the transitional labour markets that have been predicted for a long time. The working life of citizens will change, much more frequent career transitions. Unemployment benefit systems still tend to be based on a more classic industrial model of production, which has been a feature of labour markets perhaps for decades. That is really changing very rapidly, and the structure and coverage design of unemployment benefit systems needs to be altered to reflect changing patterns of work through the working life. And clearly there are a number of opportunities to think about how we can respond to these trends with response that will leave employment services in a better position than they were before the crisis if we learn the lessons most successfully and make the most appropriate responses. Clearly, there is a need to make the best use possible of EU funds. We're now in a period where new budgets are being considered and decided for the period going ahead to the latter part of this decade, how to make best use of funds for supporting the greening of the economy and the transition to the knowledge economy, and again thinking about how the delivery supply chains for operationalising employment policy can be made as effective as possible, which is really about making the optimum use of digital services. And finally, a phrase that has been used very frequently in the last year is that we are moving into an era of an employment service provision ecosystem. So how can the environment for delivering policies and the institutional structures be best linked to make sure that all of the partners can come together and that the whole is more than the sum of the parts in delivering very personalised services to citizens to ensure that they are not adversely affected by the fallout from COVID. Apologies, that was very rushed, but thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you for letting me open this interesting discussion.
Thank you very much, Iman, really for sharing such a rich investigation that you have conducted. We have enormous amount of information that actually we will also share with all the participants in form of the summary of findings that Iman has just presented, and we will share them after the seminar, but also there will be placed at the ETF webpage and at the open space, and they will be easily accessible in 3 languages, in English and Arabic and in Russian. And with this, I would really like to stay with the opportunities that despite so many challenges, we can still build on, and so well explained by Iman. Thank you very much. I can see we have already some comments and questions that I would still like to encourage you to post during the chat, and we will pick them after our next part of the event. We will have in a while a panel discussion facilitated by my colleague Franca Crestani. But before that, let me introduce another colleague, Eva Jansova, who will pose 2 questions to you, also to facilitate further reflection and discussion. Eva, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ivona. So this is the time when we would like to ask you, our participants, to share your experiences or your views on the delivery of the employment services in the current context. So shortly, you will see on your screens a couple of questions, and we will ask you to always select up to 2 answers that you find most relevant. I would like to remind everybody that we will project the questions in English, but you will see the translation in Russian and in Arabic in the chat, and you can of course follow the interpretation while selecting the right interpretation channel. So let's start, and I would ask my colleagues to project the first question. Okay, here we go. So the first question is, what are the biggest challenges in delivering employment services in the current pandemic context, according to you? Is it first, limited contact with clients? Second, limited capacity of staff in public employment services? Third, inefficient delivery models of employment services? Or last option, is it the limited evidence on labor market skills needs? So if you need translation, please look at the chat, and I remind everybody that the question relates to the biggest challenges in delivering employment services, and the answers possible are limited contact with clients, limited capacity of staff in public employment services, inefficient delivery models of employment services, or limited evidence. So I see that many people have already voted, so let's wait a few seconds more. Okay. So 10 more seconds. So up to 2 possible answers. So I think we can now close the poll and share the results. So as you can see, the most voted option was inefficient delivery models of employment services, followed by the limited evidence on labor market skills needs, which let's say call for policy responses in this area. So now we would like to move to the second question. So I will ask my colleagues again to share the second question. And this question relates to the actions that you would like to prioritize. Again, the question is posted in English, but you can see the translation in the chat. So what actions would you like to prioritize for strengthening employment services? Again, you can choose up to 2 options. And the options are: first, increased digitalization of service delivery; second, better targeting and outreach of vulnerable groups; third option is better employer engagement strategies; fourth option is more up-to-date labor market information; and the last option is the development of service delivery partnership with public, NGO, and private sector. So you have again about half a minute still to vote. So what actions would you prioritize for strengthening employment services? Is it the increased digitalization, better targeting and outreach of vulnerable groups, better employer engagement strategies, more up-to-date labor market information, or the last option, development of service delivery in partnerships with public, NGO, and private sector? So still I see that we are receiving some answers. Okay, 10 more seconds. And I think we can close our second poll and share the results. Okay, so as you can see, the most voted option was actually the development of service delivery partnership with public, NGO, and private sector. So it's seen as something very important to actually strengthen our partnerships and collaboration with different parts of the society. And also better targeting and outreach of vulnerable groups. That's something that was also mentioned in the presentation, and you can also find it in the reports that we will share with you after the event, that actually the targeting and outreach of vulnerable groups such as women, youth, migrants, and so on are one of, or should be one of the priorities for the future. So thank you very much for this quick input, and I will now pass the floor to Franca.
Thank you, Eva. So I'll even anticipated that this will be a panel discussion with the 2 distinguished participants, Amira Ramhost of the Regional Cooperation Council and Jochen Smith from the Directorate General for Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations. Amira and Jochen, I thank you very much for your availability to participate in this panel discussion. Will provide with their answers to different perspectives. One, Amira's one from, let's say, the Western Balkans geographical perspective, and Jochen from the Eastern Partnership, as he is the coordinator of the regional EU for Youth program in Eastern Partnership. So I would start for the first question, and the question will be the same for the 2 of you, Amira and Jochen. So we will have the opportunity to see the reply from two different perspectives. The first question is the following. If, speaking of course in general terms, how do you see the active labor market policies addressing the emerging needs in the area of social and youth from the perspective of the regional initiative where you work with? Please, Amira, if you would like to start.
Good morning, Franca, and good morning to all the participants, presenters and panelists. And thank you very much for inviting me to this very impressive event. I've been looking at the number of participants and it's just growing. And this morning's presentation has been very comprehensive, and has given me personally a lot of food for thought, and also for our team, and I'm sure for our Western Balkan partners. As you, Franca, said, I'm coming from the RCC, Regional Cooperation Council's ESA project, which is an employment and social affairs platform project, which is funded by the EU and carried out in partnership with ILO in 6 Western Balkan economies. And it's been a project which has been focusing on advancing employment opportunities through 3 components: tackling undeclared work, strengthening our institutional partners, and helping the alignment with the EU and Western Balkan, helping the alignment of Western Balkans with the EU processes. When you ask about the questions of the ALMPs, I think the Western Balkan region, like many of the other partner countries, has both challenges and opportunities. In terms of challenges, there's a very high youth unemployment rate in Western Balkan economies, ranging, I mean, depending obviously on the country context, ranging between 25, but even up to 50%. We also have long-term unemployment in many of the economies of the Western Balkan. We also have, in some of the economies of the Western Balkan, low activity rates. Then we have very large gender gaps, very high female unemployment rates. And thank you, Venera. I've noticed that you've posted the link to our webpage. So as I speak about these challenges in the labor market, these have been only accentuated by the COVID, as one can imagine, all these structural issues that the Western Balkan economies faced even before the COVID. With COVID, we know that it has hit. And then the other challenge we're also facing is a very high, relatively high presence of the informal economy, depending again on the economy, but it ranges between 18-20% to as high as 30% of all the employment in Western Balkan economies, again, depending on the economy and context. So with all these challenges, it is really important to look at the design of the active labor market policies and to have them designed to address the negative effects of the current crisis, but also to think what can be done in terms of developing measures and policy responses for the post-pandemic area, and to capture some of the opportunities that are ahead of the Western Balkans in terms of the Western Balkan 6, in terms of the enlargement process, but also in terms of the structural trends that we're seeing as we talked about digitization and greener economy. So one of the efforts that we're focused on in RCC is focusing on the analyzing and assisting our partners, our government partners, are analyzing the effectiveness of the active labor market policies and doing impact evaluations and evaluations of ALMPs. So to just broaden the evidence base of the ILMPs in the Western Balkan 6. So to make sure that this is a bit interactive, I'll stop here and let reflections from your side and from other panelists, and again, answer any questions. But delighted to be here. Thank you, Franca.
Thank you, Amira. Thank you very much. So the same question to Jochen then. Please, Jochen.
Thank you very much, and hello to everybody. Also from my side, big thank you, first of all, for this opportunity, a very interesting event, and we look forward to dig more into the findings. As often with the work of the European Training Foundations, this is very useful for us from the European Commission side to inform our policy development and also what we're doing in terms of future assistance. I found the polls and the results we just got there very interesting, giving me a bit of confirmation that hopefully we're not completely on the wrong tracks, so that a lot of the issues are seen around inefficient delivery models. And then also in terms of prioritization, that the development of service delivery partnerships and better targeting of vulnerable groups have come out as priorities. So talking a bit more about what we are doing and my work with the European Commission for the Eastern Partnership, I really come more to the topic from the youth angle. So we're now at this stage entering a new phase for the cooperation in the Eastern Partnership, which is the post-2020 framework with the new budget framework, of course, as well. And in this context, for us, the key initiative in the youth area is what we call the New Deal for Youth. And this has basically two dimensions. One that is more political, let's say, which is about promoting overall youth participation in policy making. But then also, which is more relevant here, the economic side, more the focus on investing in people, which includes the continuous support to reform of education and training systems, support to youth social entrepreneurship, but increasingly we are also looking more and more at employment policies and working with public employment services, but from our program side, especially on the youth angle, or focusing on youth employment issues. So in this context, me from Brussels, I work on the regional initiatives for all the 6 countries. And this, of course, is very much to be seen as complementary to the bilateral cooperation and the EU assistance that is happening in the different countries and managed through the EU delegations. But to zoom in a bit, even before COVID-19, for us, one a key element to look at was the response to the previous crisis, let's say. So we have started to look more at the experience of the Youth Guarantee. We wanted to learn more from what has been done inside the European Union to address issues around youth unemployment. And while, of course, every region and every country is different, in general, we see a lot of potential, and this event, I think, shows this again, to promote more knowledge exchange and to see what has worked well. In our case, in particular, for reaching out to needs, to young people, to get young people into employment in continued education, apprenticeship, or traineeship. So about priorities to enhance the responsiveness of active labor market policies, and especially when it comes to youth. So for us, the priority would be really to work more for partnership and coordination among stakeholders. We think this is crucial. And this is why also in the Youth for Youth program, we are putting more focus now on what we call youth employment partnerships. This is basically to bring together at different levels, the public employment services, education and training providers, the business sectors, social partners and civil society, and here in particular also the youth organizations. We think it's very important to have direct engagement of the youth themselves. And this is where we have started to work, for instance, with national youth councils and other representative youth organizations to promote also their better involvement in youth employment policy related initiatives. I cannot and do not want to predetermine here at this stage what will be the outcome of these multi-stakeholder dialogues that we're planning to initiate and support in the coming period. But the idea is definitely to have a discussion and to test and pilot some of the initiatives that have been successful around the Youth Guarantee. And here, just to mention a few, outreach and communication approaches towards disadvantaged youth. There's probably a lot that can be done also by strengthening the cooperation with the youth sector. Before, the example of reaching out with social workers was mentioned. There's youth workers, there's youth centers. Maybe young people can be met in the places or spaces where they feel more comfortable. Young people communicate differently, different tools, different languages. There's probably a lot of potential to work around these topics of outreach and communication. But then also another example on career guidance and counseling services. a lot can probably be done also in this context. So also considering the time, maybe I'll leave it here, but in short, since you asked about the priorities, for us, the first step is to support more youth employment partnerships to facilitate youth engagement and to give more space for multi-stakeholder dialogues.
Yeah, thank you, Jochen. Thank you very much. It's very interesting to see how, from the two perspectives, there is this big emphasis of active labor market policies seen as an important part of the answer, as it was before, as you rightly said, but now the role that they can play is much more important. And this brings me to the second question, that it's related to the role that the third sector, NGOs and all the civil society, and we have seen also in the poll replies that there is already an eye on that, how the role I'm saying of the third sector can be in supporting the need of skills reorientation, particularly important in this post-pandemic period, which will be quite long. So the floor to Amira, please.
Thank you, Franca. Definitely, as we've seen in the polls, the very important role of the third sector. But before I answer that question specifically, let me just highlight also, maybe I was too brief in my introductory remarks, that for us in the RCCSA project and generally in the Western Balkans, like Johan has spoken, youth employment is also a key policy priority. So within the Western Balkan investment framework and the EU enlargement package, one of the 10 flagship initiatives is actually the youth guarantee. So Western Balkans has this policy roadmap ahead of itself in terms of the enlargement policy roadmaps, in terms of adapting and implementing a youth guarantee in 6 Western Balkan economies. So we at the RCC have actually, in the past few months, have been actively working to develop both an analytical input, but also policy roadmaps, how the framework of the EU youth guarantee model could be implemented, obviously taking into account the context of each of the 6 Western Balkan economies in each of these 6 Western Balkan economies. So we have just finalized these policy roadmaps and actually share them with our government partners across the 6 Western Balkan economies and are getting their feedback. And we hope in the next month to actually share that. So it's a great opportunity for peer learning. As we know, one of the economies, North Macedonia, has actually implemented the youth guarantee, though on a pilot scale. But it will be an interesting focus to see how these 6 Western Balkan economies to take advantage of the models that have worked in the EU, adapt into their own context. I'm reading in the Western Balkans is youth unemployment the result of failure to focus on the economic side of the LMPs. So very specific question, and I think the issue again depends on the particular economy in focus, on a particular economy context. We have also issues of mismatch between education skills that are produced by the educational institutions and required by the employers. Then we also in some economies have relatively low inactivity rates of youth, very high levels of net youth that are neither in employment, education, or training. So it's a complex problem, and we've tried really to distill it in our analytical reports for each of the 6 economies and provide policy roadmaps, which we're now working with the government partners. It's very important that there is strong buy-in and that it's contextualized, because we can take a model, and this is something that came in earlier presentations. But back again to your questions, and again, as I was saying, one of the elements of our approach is to support peer learning. And thank you very much, ETF, for this event, because I think sharing the experiences even across not just Western Balkan 6, but across a wider range of countries and economies is really helpful for all our partners. Back to your question, Franca, on the role of third sector. This is something that is coming more and more important in our fieldwork, in our technical assistance with the PES, where we're also doing PES benchmarking and PES learning. And the input is coming in terms of greater involvement of the employers in what their needs are, what their skill sets that they're demanding from the labor market and from their potential employees are in shaping the active labor market policies. We in the RCC as a project, actually under our first component of tackling the undeclared work, we've developed a Western Balkan network where we're including both the social partners, but also our government partners to work in a holistic approach, to try to design holistic approaches to tackling the undeclared work. So obviously this is a formal established network which has been operating for the last 12 months and is focused on tackling the informality. But I personally think this social, and actually 2 weeks ago we had a seminar where you have the social partners represented by unions, represented by employer unions, trade unions, and the government partners speaking and exchanging ideas of how to tackle this problem. So I think it's an opportunity also and a model that can be explored in the context of the active labor market policies, and then also the role of the third sector in delivery and also in capacity delivery, but also in expanding the skill sets, because partnerships are really the opportunity. And the period behind us and also the period ahead of us, I think definitely points to uncertainty and volatility. I think we all would like to think as we all like to think that COVID is kind of behind us, but as COVID has proven, new challenges will come up and partnerships really expand the skill base in terms of delivery and expertise and responsiveness to challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amira. Thank you very much. I see that questions are in the chat, but they will be taken afterwards by Ivona. So I would pass the floor to Jochen to conclude this discussion. Please, Jochen.
Yeah, thank you. So about the role of the third sector, especially when it comes to skills reorientation in the post-pandemic time. Well, not just because of the COVID recovery, but overall there is a huge need and at the same time a potential for the third sector. Looking in particular at the changes that were mentioned before, a more knowledge-based economy, but then also the transition of green and digital. So yeah, for this skills orientation towards more green and digital, this is something where from the European Commission side, we set this also clearly as priority in the context of our external cooperation and in the future work for the Eastern Partnership. So we are already in the context of EU4Youth program supporting regional projects that support employability and skills development and social entrepreneurship. And this is mainly in cooperation with NGOs. So these are regional projects that are mainly run through NGO partners with many non-formal education initiatives, support to social entrepreneurship startups that provide mentoring, coaching for young people and similar initiatives. The colleagues have already kindly put the link into the chat if you want to look more at examples and some success stories around this. I invite you to also check our recently published achievements report. So this can give you a couple of more concrete examples of these projects. But we are also having a next phase coming for EU4Youth. And here the focus will be really very much on digital and green again. It's interesting because many people think young people, everybody is so IT savvy. Digital skills are not such a problem for the young generation, but from what we have read and heard so far, there's actually also there quite a divide, and we have issues about inclusion and inclusivity. So one focus of our next support through grant projects will be about the upskilling of digital competences for disadvantaged youth. And again, here, this is clearly also a part where other players can and should help in the capacity development. So this is something where we see definitely also space and possibility for third sector players. And then second, with the Future Grant Scheme, we will continue to promote youth entrepreneurship, but very much linked to the green economy and related skills development. So yes, definitely, there is an important role for the third sector in skills development and skills reorientation. And with the Youth for Youth program in the Eastern Partnership, we will definitely continue to support related initiatives.
Thank you, Jochen. Just before passing the floor to Ivona for the questions, just I would like to conclude with 2 words saying that there is an effort from what you have said, both Amira and Jochen, in using a previous experience mainly on cooperation, inclusion, networking to provide new answers. So this seems to be the effort and the role that the third sector can play, having acted always on the ground. So they have more the knowledge of the real situation, also in terms of vulnerability in their hands. So thank you very much again. It was very, very interesting. Please, Ivona, the floor with you.
Thank you very much, Franca, for guiding such an interesting discussion and interventions. Thank you, Amira and Jochen. We have actually quite a lot of movement on the chat. We are sharing the documents with our colleagues that our speakers kindly also shared with us. And what is, for me, one of the takeaways, actually, what also ETF is trying to do is about our learning together and our acting together across countries and across regions. We see many common challenges, and we also see many common opportunities. And we also have some questions on the chat. Let me just quickly come back to Eamon with a very quick question posed by Raisa Dogaro on wage subsidies. If you could just quickly elaborate who and how introduced the wage subsidies as a measure within active labor market policies. And the second question would be to Amira and Jochen on a very actually important element about the mobility, in particular of young people towards the EU, and how it should be addressed in the regional programs. So first, let me invite Iman for a quick answer, and then Amira and Jochen on the mobility, in particular of young people.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ivona. The subsidies were, well, they're basically administered by the government agencies. I think most cases organised through the labour and employment organisations. They were, I think, in most cases, continuations or slight expansions of continuing wage subsidy schemes that had been around for some time. And indeed, quite a lot of the developments were building on programs that were originally introduced in response to the global fiscal crisis from 2008, actually. So I think it was broadly a supplement and complement to existing schemes in most regards. But again, there's more detail that can be found in the report document. So thank you very much, Eamon. Indeed, well, as said, the summaries of the report will be shared with you, but also soon the full publication will be available. So if I can just quickly still come back to Amira and Jochen on the issue of mobility of young people and your perspective from Western Balkans and Eastern Partnership.
Thank you very much, Ivona. And thank you to Isilda for a very, very relevant question. I'm sure for the Western Balkan context, but I'm also sure for other countries, because we've been seeing pre-COVID high levels of brain drain, and particularly with the issue of the youth. And COVID may have actually one can think of one of the rare elements positive elements of COVID. It might have been in temporarily stopping that brain drain, but I would say it's only temporary. And one of the focus of RCC is actually fostering, enhancing mobility and intra-regional mobility within the Western Balkan 6. And this is not necessarily in the focus of my project, it's a project of the ESAP, but RCC is working on intra-regional mobility in terms of recognition of certain academic degrees, recognition of other regional initiatives, the common regional market, very much so, which is an approach to enhance employment opportunities in the region. So definitely, yes. To be very specific in answering your question of the youth guarantee, we are at a very, very inception phase right now with the Western Balkan 6 economies. We've just designed these analytical inputs in terms of policy roadmaps and engaging with the Western Balkan 6 governments. So again, it's not even phase 0. It's analytical phase leading to phase 0. So what the next phases will look like will obviously depend on the individual economy's commitment to the design of the youth guarantees, to the EU enlargement process, and the political and other dialogues. But definitely the question that you posed is a very important one that we will be looking and supporting our government partners to understand, and looking at Western Balkan 6 as a region. That's certainly been our approach, and try to address it within the youth guarantees. I hope I've addressed the question.
Thank you very much, Amira. As the question is also relevant to Eastern Partnership, and also in particular now on the reflection on youth partnerships to build better youth policies. If I could invite also Johan just to elaborate whether there are mobility elements also in Eastern Partnership programs.
Sure. So when it comes to the youth guarantee type initiatives, similar to what the colleague from the Western Balkans just said, we're at an early stage. We're currently providing information and trying to foster this knowledge exchange, and also starting an analysis based on the real situation in each of the countries, what could be interesting elements to take up. I mentioned some initiatives before, like more on outreach communication, more on counseling and guidance related topics, but it will really depend on the different countries. So we're looking at mobility, not yet, I would say, so much when it comes to training or learning experiences. But we have, on the other hand, of course, many existing opportunities and programs. I'm referring here in particular to the Erasmus Plus, of course, where in the coming period, also for the Eastern Partnership, there will be more opportunities in the context of the Erasmus Plus vocational and education and training branch. And in general, I mean, the existing mobilities, including in the youth field, are very relevant learning opportunities as well. Let's not forget that when we're looking at future skills and competencies, a lot of the core skills, a lot of the key competencies are not from formal learning only for the future, but there's a lot of non-formal and informal learning that can happen also through mobility. And this is something where in the existing framework of Erasmus Plus, a lot is already happening.
Thank you very much, Johan. Really very interesting points. And with this, I would like to thank Amira and Johan, and also Franca, for this interesting discussion and those interesting, really, and also giving us more food for thoughts and for our reflection. And with this, let me introduce our next session, and I will give the floor to Christina for guiding us throughout the second part of the event. Please, Christina, over to you.
Thank you, Ivona, and also thanks to your great speakers. And I want to thank also to be grateful for the questions and remarks posted in chat. Let's continue doing that, as that we can address all your questions, interest, and even dilemma, like the last example, how to manage a wage subsidy scheme in crisis, in pandemic context. And we know that a lot of countries and public employment service coordinators are confronted with such challenges in a low demand or volatile demand context. Our second session moves a bit to the hope that, like next year, this time we will have a bit of normality, that we will start building the recovery. And as many colleagues that are joining today, the workshop, a crisis, a shock, is also a great opportunity to learn, to rethink, and to build back better, ideally. Therefore, in our research, we also focused on the effectiveness of the active labor market policies, with a particular focus on the human capital, dimension of upskilling and reskilling, because we know that that would be usually it's a rather difficult and underdeveloped dimension of the active labor market policies in general. It is my pleasure to manage this session with three contributors. Lukasz Sienkiewicz is the author of the main author of the LMP's effectiveness report. Venera has already posted in chat a link where you'll find the summaries of these two reports, and we hope that in 1 month or 2 months' time, we will also be able to share with you the full reports. The other two contributors are our colleagues from the OECD, Theodora Xenogianni, and also our colleague from the Commission, from DG Employment, Kamil Balica. Since we are a bit of late, in our session, I would swiftly move to Lukasz and invite the contractor to upload also the presentation. But on the other side, please don't hurry when you speak, because our colleagues, the interpreters, cannot keep up with us. So Lukasz, take your time, but try to fit into 15 minutes max. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I have a pleasure to present the second part of our work on focusing on active labor market policies effectiveness. And as already Christina said, I would strengthen this notion that LMPs play a crucial role in the short term as a stabilizer in terms of the crisis. But we believe that it also is crucial in long-term recovery and building a better adjusted workforce in terms of future skills and employability. And this is a very important point to make. So LMPs should not only be seen as a short-term measure. So let me go first through the context and aims of our work, and then very briefly about the methodology. From this perspective of the context, it is very important to look at opportunities created, not only treating the crisis situation as a sort of hard to combat situation as it is, but also the opportunity to innovate and to reset social objectives, but also to experiment and possibly upscale in the future some of the active labor market policies that were the most successful. But in doing so, we have to understand very well which ALMPs are not only effective in general, but which are effective in a short term in combating the crisis. And to do so, we have to review the past crisis approaches, especially the crisis of 2008-2009, and the new developments that have been there since the outbreak of the COVID crisis. We know that in terms of the stable economic cycle and situation that is not that gruesome on the labor market, the LMPs might be effective in a different way than in such a deep and symmetric crisis that was in the at the outbreak of COVID. So the idea here is also, the aim here is to document some key lessons and findings for ETF partner countries. So in order to be able to design, of course, their own policies and to fit the mix of ALMPs that would be the most appropriate to meeting the challenges of the crisis situation. So in order to do so, in terms of the time limits and other resource limits, we have not performed a totally new research study, but we have reviewed all available sources in terms of literature, studies, and meta-analysis, but also research reports from the EU, but also everything we could find on the ETF partner countries. So we have designed a multi-stage process to find out about the key information and trying to understand what really works in different contexts, of which I will tell in a moment. So we try to cluster the information and did a critical review of policy responses, trying to analyze for which target groups and in which situations the specific LMPs have been the most successful. And finally, we came with some recommendations for shaping these LMPs in the future. Next slide, please. So we have come in our review to some challenges at first, and we have to very well understand the limitations of LMP's effectiveness analysis. First of all, there is some specific context in which LMPs work, and this might be, of course, like here, the informality of the economy that can affect the effectiveness of ALMP's measures, but also the level of GDP or spending, or if the public employment services capacity, especially in developing and transitions countries, can affect, in fact, the possibility and ability to implement some of the, sorry, can we go back to the previous slide? The possibility of implementing some of the LMPs, but also their effectiveness. So it is really challenging, in fact, to find some of the evaluations that take into account the challenges met by EU neighborhood and Central Asia and ETF partner countries. So we have been struggling to find out and to find the reports and studies that were taking into account the evaluations there. So this was also a challenge. But one of the key challenges is that we need to take the net effects into account when in fact analyzing LMP's effectiveness. So this requires a careful and detailed information about the negative effects, like deadweight displacement or substitution effect, which is not always really there in the studies available, because it requires the experimental and quasi-experimental approach, or if the counterfactual impact evaluation. And this is really challenging in majority of the countries we have reviewed. I'm not saying that there are no such reports, but they are scarce and really should be further developed. What is more, and I think this is very challenging, is the approach taken to definition of effectiveness of ALMPs. And this is really challenging in terms of comparability, because we usually consider the effectiveness of ALMPs in a simplified way, looking at the employability or a short and medium and long-term effect, employment effect of the person we are helping. But in fact, this is very varied across countries, and sometimes different things are being measured, like job quality or job duration or productivity or earnings or decreasing poverty rate, or even the soft outcomes like subjective well-being, career confidence, or positive attitude towards work. So getting people closer to the labor market might be the effect of the LMPs, which will not be seen in hard evidence and hard data, but might be as well as important. So most of the evaluations focus on measurable outcomes, but especially at the most disadvantaged people, there might be better outcomes which are not really be able to be seen in employment of these people. So next slide, please. We have, can we move to the, yes, thank you. So looking at the effectiveness of different ALMPs, disregarding the context, we have used the classification employed by European statistics, dividing ALMPs into 6 broad groups, and we tried to analyze what works for whom from the perspective of the target groups and why in the given context, looking at these 6 broad ALMPs groups. So sometimes, and this is really important to say, that most of the ALMPs show the most effect when combined with other LMPs, and this is a very important factor. So it's rather the policy mix that we should be aiming for in terms of creating effective ALMPs response than just focusing on the effectiveness of a given measure. But when you look at the details, in terms, for example, the training programs, it is most effective when combined with counseling, career guidance and counseling, but it shows also the greatest effectiveness in the longer run. So in terms of this, we should rather not treat training policies in terms of ALMPs as just the short-term policies for reskilling for the COVID situation, but they might be effective, of course, but rather focus on what has already been said today, on future skills, on practical, digital, soft skills that might be important in the future world of work after the crisis. In terms of employment incentives, there was a question about this also in the chat. This is really a widely used measure, both in the EU countries, but also in the ETF partner countries. As the majority of EU countries have used some sort of employment incentive, be it wage subsidy or subsidized employment or elevation of social security contributions in terms of the crisis. And this is very effective, but rather prone to these negative effects, especially displacement and deadweight effects. So we have to remember to target it very closely at specific target groups. It is very important as a stabilizer in recession, but again, shows the most effectiveness when delivered together with training. So it's just not subsidized employment, because then the employers, of course, will value this and will use this, but we have to provide the future perspective. So, for example, retraining towards the new or changed needs of these people in the changing labor market. Of course, the direct job creation have also been used, but if it's more effective, as we have seen in the studies, in those countries that have rather low institutional coherence. And this is important in some of the low income countries, and thus might be very effective in combating the immediate and short-term crisis situation. For sheltered and supported employment measures, this is a rather narrow or limited group of ALMPs, most efficient and working usually with 4 persons with disabilities. For startup incentives, this is questionable in terms of the crisis in many cases, as it is really hard to run the business and start the business in the crisis situation, but so the effectiveness is maximized during the economic growth phase rather, or when the possibilities for business take-up are higher. But this might be very effective for delivering social and training benefits, especially for women. So empowering of some social groups might be the key outcome of these measures, not necessarily the increase in employment itself. And this has to be remembered as there will be some offspring outcomes also of these measures. And one of the last but not least is the job search assistance. But it shows the most effective, and as in countries with high level of institutional capacity or coherence, and this is more about engaging people more and bringing them closer to an active approach in job search in the countries where the availability of jobs is rather high. So can we go to the next slide, please? So these were the key observations looking at the groups of LMPs, but we have also looked at the more project-based approaches on the example of the projects under the European Social Fund. And this is important as a lesson to ETF partner countries and the Eastern partnership, because some of the EU-funded project or donor-funded projects work in a similar way. So what we have found in terms of the LMP's effectiveness in this regard is that it is more effective when interventions are really well customized to labor market demand, and as have already been said in the poll, are delivered in a partnership-based mode. So a partnership with public, private, and NGOs institutions. It also requires, due to some technicalities, I would say, and formalities that need to be met, it requires a good management capacity. So it has to be remembered. These are rather demanding projects in this term, but have important impact. And are the most effective, and this is quite interesting, for people at certain medium rather than high distance from the labor market. And this has to be also taken into consideration, as these are project-based approaches. So they usually have the start and the finish date. And these are rather a few years, up to few years project, while the people most distant from the labor market need rather comprehensive and long-term support. So have to be combined in a sense with other supporting measures. Next slide, please. And the final observations is that to take the things ahead or forward for the ETF partner countries, we believe that it is crucial to strengthen and adjust probably the LMP's design and delivery capacity, especially as it requires not only the development and comprehensiveness of LMPs, but also development of institutional capacity. So as in the second bullet point, it is about a wide range of LMPs offered. As I already said, the policy mix is the most effective, not the given measure in itself. So a comprehensive approach needs to be offered. But also supporting and development of implementation structures, especially those working on the ground with individuals and businesses as employers are and need to be also involved. But also resource capacity, meaning not only physical resources of pairs, but also the staff resources or human resources and the competences and skills of the staff. It is also very important, and I was really glad to hear from our discussions from the previous session that there are efforts taken to build evidence based on effectiveness of policies, because this is really helpful. We strive in the EU countries to build more evidence-based policy. This becomes really a focal point. So in terms of the ATF partner countries, we also need to have an evidence base to know what works in a given situation. And it needs to strengthen monitoring and evaluation. We need to do more regular impact assessments, and possibly also capture the social impacts, these indirect effects of LMPs that are not visible only in terms of the employment measures. And we need to also take the future perspective, not only the pandemic, but post-pandemic period, also including these long-term trends for digital and green transitions. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I give back the floor to Christina.
Thank you, Lukasz, for this comprehensive presentation, and just wanted to explain why we focused in the presentation also on the experience of the European Social Fund. We know that the EU neighborhood and Central Asia do not have access to this because it's specific to the EU member states, but on the other side, the typology of EU funding for the EU neighborhood is rather similar in terms of objectives and the content of the programs. Therefore, we wanted to look at this experience, since there is also a scientifically based good research behind in the assessment of this of the impact of these investments. And as you know, the EU, it's rather diverse in terms of socio-economic context. We have countries and regions with, for example, youth unemployment rates higher than those in the ETF partner countries. So there is a huge mutual learning potential looking at this effect. I thank you, colleagues, for exchanging in the chat, and just wanted to briefly underline another message that comes out from your research, Lukasz. The LMPs are not only to raise the employment rate, so the effectiveness measurement has to take into account additional elements. And there is an excellent example shared by our colleagues from Azerbaijan, who said, in the context of pandemic, the LMPs and wage subsidies and all these policy responses in the context have also helped addressing the informality. Yeah, so informal enterprises became, translated into the formal labor market. So it's a good effect as well. But of course, there is no immediate impact on raising the employment rate. Okay. Please continue this exchange in chat, and we will address it. Now I give the floor to my colleague Eva to run another poll, the last one.
So this is the second time when we seek your views and your input. Again, shortly you will see a poll on your screen, and I remind everybody that you can see also the translation in Russian and Arabic in the chat. And what is our question this time? So our question is, what active labor market policies measures would you prioritize for supporting the reintegration of workers in the labor market? And the possible answers are: first, reskilling and upskilling; second possibility, employment subsidies; third, startup incentives and entrepreneurial training and coaching; and the last possible option, intensified job search assistance, including career guidance. I remind everybody that you can choose up to 2 responses, and I see that people are active in responding to the question. So what active labor market policies would you prioritize to support reintegration of workers? Is it reskilling, upskilling, employment subsidies, startup incentives, or intensified job search assistance? And I believe we can still wait a few seconds. Okay. Please try to respond and express your views. And I think we can close now and show the results. So what is the winner? So what solutions or policy measures you think should be prioritized and promoted? So it's the reskilling and upskilling. This is the most important, let's say, response that I think is most effective in order to support skills development and the inclusion of those most affected by the pandemic back into the labor market. And I think it's in line with our study, so that's very positive. So thank you, and I will pass the floor back to Christina.
Thank you very much, Eva, and thank you to all of you for practically over prioritizing the upskilling and reskilling element. Of course, this is it's an absolute need looking at the labor market changes that we face today, and we can also anticipate for tomorrow if you look at the greening and digital transformation as well. Let's move to the second panel discussion of today, and it is my pleasure to introduce our colleague from the OECD, the Directorate for Employment and Labor Market and Labor and Social Affairs, Ms. Teodora Xenogianni. Welcome to our event, Teodora. Hello, and then we will also have the pleasure to hear from our colleague from the Commission, from DG Employment, Mr. Kamil Balica. Hello, Kamil.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Since, again, in terms of time management, I'm not very talented. I have to confess that it's something that I have to learn. Let's move now quickly with the questions. And please, Teodora and Kamil, in your answers, please also look at the chat and reflect some of the statements that are already there. And then at the end, Lukasz, I will give you the floor for a quick answer to our colleague that posted an important question about the ALMP's usage in pandemic context. Teodora, Lukasz has already mentioned in his presentation that a big challenge is having reliable sources about the ALMP's effectiveness. And we know that the literature on this topic is quite developed for the OECD or more advanced economies. Looking at the conclusions there, but also in the context of transition and developing countries, could you share with us few key lessons about the LMPs, the role of public employment services in this context of pandemic, and looking at the post-crisis recovery, do you have, like, I don't know, 1, 2, 3 big priorities to invest in? What would be your advice?
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to participate in this event today, and I'd like to thank Christina and the organizers for inviting me. It's a very interesting and also very policy relevant event. So as Christina said, I work in the Skills and Employability Division of the OECD Directorate for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs. I really enjoyed the presentations and the discussions in session 1 and the presentations in this session, which I find that complements very well all the work we have been doing over the past year at the OECD in relation to COVID, and in cooperation with the European Commission, in particular DG Employment, but also DG Reform. And in fact, it's great food for thought for me, and extremely relevant information on lessons from more countries. As was already highlighted by many speakers today, although there may be different needs and different contexts across countries, there is still a lot of scope for exchange and for peer learning between OECD, non-OECD countries, between more and less developed countries, between countries with different systems, ALMP systems. So to that effect, at the OECD, we have had many discussions, in fact, on this topic with our member countries. We published back in April 2020 a policy brief on public employment services in the front line for employees, job seekers, and employers, which I think the link has been shared or will be shared in the chat. And tomorrow or Friday, we will be publishing a new policy brief on scaling up policies that connect people with jobs in the recovery from COVID-19. And in a few days or weeks, there will be another policy brief on designing active labor market policies for the recovery. And we will be happy to share all this information with you. So let me just now go back a bit to the context and the current situation in EU and OECD countries. I will be focusing precisely on these countries. And I would like to make maybe 4 or 5 key points, which are based on the analysis we have made of responses that these countries provided to a questionnaire we did together with DG Employment of the European Commission. First, I wanted to stress this, that despite all the social distancing restrictions, the difficulties in service provision, and fairly limited job vacancies, 41% of all unemployed people contacted the public employment services to find work in 2020 in Europe and in Turkey, which is just 4 percentage points below the respective share in 2019. This highlights the need for PES to continue providing good quality services to an even bigger number of clients after the crisis. Second point I wanted to make is that to have effective ALMPs, we need to have sufficient budget and sufficient capacity in the public employment services to provide these measures. In fact, OECD and EU countries have responded very quickly to the COVID-19 crisis by increasing the spending for public employment services and other active labor market measures over the course of 2020 and in early 2021. 63% of EU and OECD countries increased their budget for labor market services over the course of 2020, and 73 did also so for active labor market measures. In addition, 67% of OECD and EU countries reported staff reallocations in their public employment services as an immediate, let's say, reaction to deal with the most pressing tasks. Of course, these staff reallocations were not sufficient, and over half of these countries reacted by hiring additional PES staff over the course of 2020. So a key question is whether this will be enough. It's a little bit too early to tell. Following the global financial crisis, OECD countries scaled up ALMP spending more strongly than in previous recessions. But despite that, spending per unemployed person declined by 21% on average back then. Therefore, we call for larger additional investments into PES and ALMPs in this specific context now, in order to support the allocation of labor from declining to growing sectors in the coming months and years, maybe. I will skip maybe some points that I wanted to make about how PES used the digital services to serve the growing number of clients. And I will move on to describe a bit how countries moved from short-term responses, which concerned mainly PES operating models, to longer-term responses, which is what we are concerned with in this session. And the long-term strategies will focus more on how to support job seekers, employees, and employers rather than the delivery models and the PES operating models. And the upcoming changes should look into the mix of ALMPs, as was already also highlighted by Lucas in his presentation. So Lucas already talked a lot about this in ETF partner countries. The situation is not very different in OECD and EU countries. First, training programs, including longer programs, have been found to be particularly effective during past crises, because any lock-in effects, the effects of the periods that people do not search for employment because they are on training, can tend to be smaller during periods of, let's say, low demand. In addition, because recessions tend to be associated with periods of accelerated structural change, which lead to reallocation of workers across industries and occupations, job seekers need to acquire new skills to become re-employed without experiencing significant losses in their earnings. So in line with this evidence, a quarter of EU and OECD countries have increased their training offers, and 73% of countries moved classroom-based training online. And about 70% of EU and OECD countries introduced new online courses. And what is new in the current context is that the demand for digital skills is higher than before. And PES have also responded to this, let's say, new or increasing need by providing more training on digital skills. A second key category is employment incentives. Lucas also talked about it. And in fact, two-thirds of OECD and EU countries scaled up their employment incentives, and 1/3 lowered social contributions for some or for all employers for a limited period of time. Lucas already mentioned that employment incentives can suffer from deadweight losses and displacement, which can be minimized if these measures are well targeted to the people in need, even though this might entail a risk of stigmatization and even lower employer take-up. Indeed, many EU and OECD countries also targeted their new measures to young job seekers, to the long-term unemployed, people with disabilities, older unemployed, and other vulnerable groups. Finally, rightly so, public sector direct job creation programs can be used to support especially very vulnerable groups and those furthest from the labor market. And even though the effectiveness of these programs tends to be limited in terms of measurable long-term employment outcomes, they can be useful in maintaining the employability of some vulnerable groups while they provide, let's say, income support to these groups. So this is about the effectiveness of ALMPs. Christina, should I move on to your second question about the three priorities?
Exactly. Yes. Just to briefly introduce the topic of upskilling and reskilling, we see here that everyone prioritized it. But in practice, we notice that not only in the developing and transition countries, but also in the more developed and EU member states, we see that the participation in lifelong learning is rather modest. And with the pandemic, the delivery of upskilling and reskilling services has been heavily affected as well. And you mentioned already this need of workforce transition and the value of skills. So the point is, how do we ensure that nobody is left behind? How can we target those vulnerable groups that are less prone to attend and to complete training courses? What would you prioritize in terms of actions?
Yes,
very quick answer. Thank you.
Yes, sorry. So I think first key priority to reach out to these groups is to identify them. And this can only be done with accurate and rich information, which cannot be collected only through public employment services. It has to come from different providers, different institutions that provides education, health, and social services to these vulnerable groups. And so this is the only way to identify them, understand their needs, and define the best strategies to reach out to them. So I would prioritize that vis-a-vis vulnerable groups. And then for these specific groups, individualized support and holistic support is required. So only services by the public employment services will not be sufficient. And I think this holds across all countries. I would also like to highlight, especially for this group, the need for face-to-face interaction. And the fact that many of the PES services are indeed delivered online for many of the clients might free up some time for these groups that need more and value more the face-to-face interaction.
Thank you. Excellent points, Teodora. And actually, this anticipates the discussion that we will have in June in our corporate conference, the ETF corporate conference, that is focused on the lifelong learning, building lifelong learning systems. And one element is also keep them, securing inclusiveness of lifelong learning systems. So thanking you and also noting that Venera has uploaded all the links that you have kindly shared, and colleagues and participants can look at the additional research that OECD has produced. Let's move now to the our last speaker in this session. Mr. Kamil Balica works in the international unit of DG Employment, the Commission. He is very close to the Western Balkan realities, given his job profile, but he's here also to share with us the new priorities at the Commission level and in the EU member states that are also very relevant for the EU neighborhood and Central Asia countries. Kamil, in the first session, we have already touched on the issue of youth unemployment, this extremely difficult year when we saw that millions of children and young people and new graduates did not have good access to education. So with a deeply disruptive education and training process, we expect a lot of difficulties in 2021, in 2022 when it comes to transition from school to work. But on the other side, there is this great example of the youth guarantee. And we know that several countries, particularly North Macedonia, but other countries are inspired from these schemes. So what is this potential of the youth guarantee, in your opinion, for the EU neighborhood and Central Asia? Please.
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Christina, thank you very much for this question. I would first like to say I'm very pleased to assist to this conference. The discussions, presentations have been very rich and interesting. And as you said, the panelists before me have discussed EU support to the Eastern Partnership and also to the Western Balkans as regards young people. I would just first like to complete the picture and to add that the newly adopted joint communication on the renewed partnership for the southern neighborhood is also mentioning action points for scaling up of initiatives inspired by the Youth Guarantee Scheme in the southern neighborhood of the European Union. Just a little point before I enter to the Youth Guarantee as regards Western Balkans, RCC work mentioned by Amira is indeed an important analytical input. But as I lead the enlargement team in DG Employment, I would like to add to this that for the Western Balkans, Youth Guarantee has featured also very prominently now in the current economic reform program process and in the discussions that we have and we will have at ministerial level with Western Balkans and Turkey. And the European Commission is engaging right now in exchanges with Western Balkan authorities and plans to organize bilateral meetings as well as regional events to raise awareness of the Youth Guarantee and work with Western Balkan countries to set up interministerial task forces to develop Youth Guarantee implementation plans. Because the approach to Youth Guarantee needs to be, as you will hear from my reply that I will provide right now, needs to be really intersectoral. So Youth Guarantee is an ambitious scheme, of course. It caters for different categories of needs with an individualized approach, leading to an offer of employment, continued education, apprenticeship, or traineeship. Now, we have different categories of needs. Counseling, guidance, and mentoring are particularly important for needs without particular barriers for entering the labor market. For example, many of those who are needs due to the crisis, including many higher education graduates. Regular job mediation also, of course, complements this. Traineeships can be helpful in the current times where employers are reluctant to open new positions. Support to entrepreneurship can also work well, building on ideas and the active spirit of young people, and supporting also the supply side of the labor market. I will now repeat the messages that others said, but targeted and temporary hiring subsidies can also be used for some categories of young people who are harder to place, but they are more effective if combined with a training element. Let me say a few words about apprenticeships. They can offer an excellent way to provide workplace experience to young people and to increase their chances to find a job very often with the same employer. Hiring apprentices is also pays off to the employers, because in the current times they train their future workers, and will be ready to pick up again when the economy picks up. We are facing transformation of the economy too, and the skills of some young people need to be complemented or increased through short or longer courses, including vocational courses. Climate change and environmental degradation require an adaptation of the economy. We expect job growth to be concentrated in green or greening sectors, while job losses will occur in carbon-intensive sectors. In the digital economy of tomorrow, we expect that artificial intelligence and robotics alone will create almost 60 million jobs worldwide in the next 5 years, while many jobs will change or even disappear. So that shows need for adaptation. So for young people with low levels of skills and qualification, Youth Guarantee gives a chance to re-enter the regular education and training system. We should not forget that it's not only about ALMPs, it's also about helping young people back into education to obtain higher level qualification. And I should not forget the prevention side of the Youth Guarantee, which is very important, also taking into account the strong impact on education that this crisis has had. Early warning systems help collect information about attendance and sometimes performance of young people at school. So based on identification of potential issues, concerted cooperation between education and social services can be offered to prevent dropouts. And tracking services can also help identifying and monitoring individual students and offering them support before they drop out or just after they drop out, so they don't fall out of the radars of public registers. So to conclude, Youth Guarantee offers a potential to address the outstanding challenges for a diverse group of young people based on their individual situation.
Thank you, Kamil, for this excellent contribution underlying the value of holistic intervention when it comes to such a vulnerable group in this context as young people. I just want to announce participants that Venera has uploaded already the key reference documents to these elements that are promoted by the European Commission, the European Union in general. Now moving to the last reflection from your side. We know that the European Union has offered a lot of financial support to the EU neighborhood and Central Asia, and there are also a big support to the recovery efforts in this region, and not only. In this context, I wanted to hear from you what are the most important messages emerging from this from the newest policy orientation at EU level. We know that there is a new skills agenda, there is this new recommendation and youth focused package, a specific recommendation looking at the upskilling and reskilling pathways, and finally, most important, this support to employment in a transition to employment in the pandemic context. So what would you share with us on this in the context of recovery, of course?
Thank you, Christina. So when it comes to policy messages, of course, in the first year of the crisis, the main priority was to preserve jobs. And in the EU, this objective has been successfully achieved. And also we have had policy dialogue with enlargement countries and with neighborhood countries where we were recommending the use of job preservation measures and also short-time work schemes to contain the rise in unemployment. As we are now entering the second year of the crisis, the challenges will be different. Short-time work schemes are no longer the only policy option. Many businesses are likely to emerge from the prolonged crisis in a state of financial distress and may not survive. And there are also changes triggered by the green and digital transitions that are transforming our economies. So a strong reallocation of the workforce in the European labor markets is expected to take place. And I imagine that similar patterns will be happening in the EU neighborhood. Preserving employment continues to be a priority, and short-time work support should not be discontinued abruptly. At the same time, employment policies should gradually shift from preserving jobs to promoting job creation and easing job-to-job transitions in order to promote and accelerate structural change. The Commission, as you have pointed out already, Christina, has come with a recommendation on effective active support to employment that aims to bridge the gap between the short-term emergency response to the crisis in terms of preservation of jobs and the measures that are needed to support a job-rich recovery and the EU long-term goal of greener, digital, competitive, and very important, inclusive economy. This recommendation, I think, to which the participants will also have a link, provides concrete guidance to the member states of the European Union on the measures needed to accompany labor market transitions from declining to expanding sectors, including the green and digital ones. And the recommendation calls on member states to develop coherent packages of strengthened active labor market policies consisting of 3 components. The first is time-limited and well-designed hiring and transition incentives with a strong training component and support to entrepreneurship. The second is upskilling and reskilling opportunities linked to the labor market needs. This is very important. We need labor market, we need intelligence on the needs, skill needs in the labor market to provide the relevant upskilling and reskilling. And the last, enhanced support by employment services for job transitions, which also means that we need to invest in the capacities of public employment services. And this message I'm repeating also what the previous speakers have said, including Theodor. In terms of skills policies, the recommendation relies on the 2020 skills agenda, and it asks member states to put in place comprehensive skill strategies, develop up-to-date labor market and skills intelligence, ensure the labor market relevance of education and training, provide entitlements for quality assured training and career guidance to all adults, and reinforce the recognition and validation of learning and experience. And let me just add on the skills agenda. It puts a big emphasis on adult learning, which needs to increase. Currently, a little bit more than 1/3 of adults participate in every year in a learning activity. This needs to increase to 50% by 2025 and to 60% by 2030. These are the goals of the new skills agenda. This is needed both to help the low qualified to enhance their skills levels and to ensure at the same time that the qualified workers develop further their skills so that we can create and master innovation. Digital skills play a big role here. So to conclude, we have no choice. We have to ensure that initial education and training enable all people to develop a good skill basis, and we have to boost adult upskilling and reskilling to be able to have a job-rich recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamil. This is an excellent concluding message. So I would not spend more time on drawing conclusions because you made an excellent synthesis of the message that we want to pass. I ask the participant to stay a few minutes with us because I would also like to address one point that our a colleague has raised in chat. It's about the effectiveness of the ALMPs and how can we prevent abuses or unjustified usage and how we can better target this. So I would invite Lukasz Sienkiewicz to address this point, building on his experience in assessing the ALMPs. How do we secure that ALMPs reach out and impact the right groups and clients? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. Of course, it's not an easy question or not an easy job because there will be always some abuse and some fraudulent practices, as we know from past experience. But of course, we can ensure at least 3 main points or areas where we can act. So first of all is the design of the measure, starting from the right eligibility criteria set, who can use it, but also including the job quality criteria for the support in terms of employment incentives. Of course, we need to very carefully use choose the target groups, because this is really crucial in terms of the design, but also ensure the combination of measures. So it's not only the support employment subsidy, but also combined with other measures. And in this regard, it will distract those who just want to get cheap labor. It will be focused on those businesses that want to support their future functioning. But also we need to require the recipients to use or plan the expected results for the enterprise. So why do we want they use this support, not just to get subsidized? The second point is monitoring, of course. The right contractual arrangements should be secured, and setting up all the responsibilities of the sites and requirements of the contract. But also in terms of monitoring, we need to understand the outcomes and closely monitor the outcomes, but also, for example, get the feedback from participants. Not only monitor the hard outcomes, but understand how do this change their lives. And in terms of the last point is, of course, the sanctioning, and this have to be remembered, but not only sanctioning. I mean, there are some formal criteria that needs to be made or needs to be met, but of course, when we focus only on sanctioning, it will not work. But if we remember that all these elements need to be put in place, this might lead to better outcomes. Of course, not 100%, but better than if we just gave out money to subsidize employment.
Thank you, Lukasz. It's an excellent point that we will revisit later this year in our workshop on LMPs, kind of training workshop on LMPs innovation. I want to conclude here with a quick summary on the next steps and issues that we will, support that we will continue to provide. With all the links that you have in chat, I just want to underline again that the summaries of these two draft reports are available in English, Russian, and Arabic. That we are also have prepared with the support of Fondazione Giacomo Brodolini 3 country reports in Jordan, Moldova, and North Macedonia, focused on the public employment services, LMPs, and reactions in the pandemic context. That we will continue and discuss also with the country stakeholders, and we will publish this report. We are also grateful for the cooperation we have with DG Employment and with international labor organizations who have kindly accepted to have a look at the cross-country reports and provide a few suggestions as external peer reviewers. Then all the presentations and resources will be shared in our open space platform. So this is a message, and you'll receive also an email after the event. It's a message and encouragement for you to join us on the open space platform, because there for us, it's more easier to share additional resources, to share also videos, and to share other kind of resources in a more straightforward way, and also to engage with you in an open discussion on, for questions, for clarifications, for whatever you need from our side, and also the community of experts that is there in open space. We will organize, as I mentioned, a cross-country event in autumn, end of October, in principle on the 25th of October. And actually, the scope of applying these polls was also to identify from your side what are the key priorities, but also I want to have I want to express my gratitude to all the speakers in these two sessions, because also they have shed light on additional challenges and issues that we need to prioritize in this in autumn. We will continue the discussion on upskilling, reskilling, and the impact and in the context of lifelong learning systems in the ETF corporate conference that will take place between 21st to 25th of June. There are certain workshops dedicated to the new emerging learning needs. Ivona is involved and leading the work on that. I will cover the issue of skills for all. So there are many topics there for you to continue the discussion and to address this important aspect that Kamil mentioned, that not all the adults are now benefiting from lifelong learning opportunities, and how do we outreach vulnerable groups. Isilda raised an important point in chat. It's also the mobility, the impact of migration on human capital development and labor market developments as well, because this impacts also, of course, the effectiveness of LNPs. And I just want to draw you to the attention that in the Western Balkans, ETF will complete a regional analysis on this topic, and we plan to disseminate the findings in September, end of September, and of course we will forward you the invitation. This afternoon we have a debate on Facebook Live on greening of economies and skills impact. So we continue this sharing of information. If you are interested, please join us, follow us on Facebook. Finally, I want to thank to all participants, to all the experts from our partner countries that have joined us today. We hope to see you soon in all these various events that also our partners are organizing. I want to thank to the authors, Iman, Lukasz, Ayub, colleagues from Jordan and Moldova and North Macedonia who helped us in this research. Finally, but not the least important, I want to thank the interpreters that are really coping with all our fast speaking pace, and also to the logistical team and my colleagues, Ivona, Franca, Eva, Benera, Manuela, and others from the ETF who have been instrumental in this for the organization of this event. Thank you very much, and we keep in touch.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to more.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. See you next time.
Wish you the health and progress in every way. Thank you so much again. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.